I used to think that goodness was a currency that never failed, that if you were kind, the world would somehow notice and repay you. But I was wrong. Goodness isn't a shield, it's bait, and people like me learn that too late. My name doesn't matter much anymore, but back then I was Arez Malik, the boy who believed that hard work and honesty could bend the world in his favor. I was raised in a quiet neighborhood in Karachi. My parents weren't rich. My father worked in a government office. My mother taught at a small school. We didn't have much, but we had pride. They always said I'd be the one to break the cycle, the one to make something of his life. And for a while, I believed them. I got a scholarship to a business university, the first from my family to ever get one. I remember the day I got the acceptance letter. My father's eyes actually teared up. He said, "Now you'll see what good people deserve, Arez." If only he knew how wrong he was. University was another world, louder, faster, crueler. But I adapted. I worked hard, stayed polite, stayed humble. That's probably what made them notice me. Zain, Samia, and Hamza. 3 names that used to mean everything. 3 people who turned my life into rubble. Zain was the kind of man everyone noticed when he walked into a room. Rich, smooth, always laughing like he owned the air around him. His father was a well-known businessman, so Zain never worried about money or consequences. Samia was his girlfriend. Pretty, poised, and the kind of person who looked right through you while pretending to care. She had this dangerous charm that made people drop their guard. And then there was Hamza, my friend, my brother. We were both from simple families. We used to sit on the dorm roof, talk about dreams, about escaping the noise of the world. I trusted him like I trusted myself. Together, we built something that looked like friendship. We laughed through late-night study sessions, shared cheap food, and spoke about building something great after graduation. I thought I'd finally found my tribe, people who believed in the same things I did. But jealousy doesn't shout, it whispers. It hides behind smiles and inside jokes. At first, it was subtle. Zain would make small comments about how I was too serious. Samia would tease me about being a workaholic. And Hamza, he'd laugh it off, tell me not to take it personally. I didn't, because I was naive. I thought they loved me like I loved them. After graduation, Zain's father offered to invest in a startup. It was everything we'd ever talked about, a company of our own. We named it Zenith Dynamics. I handled the strategy and client management. Zain took care of PR and funding. Hamza oversaw operations, and Samia handled marketing. It felt right. It felt fair. For the first few months, it was perfect. We worked like a family. Clients came in fast. My nights blurred into mornings. I poured everything I had into that company. And Zain? He smiled for cameras, shook hands, and called the company his dream. I didn't care. Credit didn't matter to me back then. I believed loyalty was the real currency. But here's something I didn't understand then. Trust isn't earned, it's traded. And I was the only one who didn't realize I was in a game. The first signs of rot were easy to miss. A few payments delayed. Some invoices misplaced. Zain would wave it off. Just cash flow stuff, Arez, don't stress. I trusted him. That's what fools do before they get gutted. We started expanding fast, too fast. Samia was handling publicity and partnerships, and I started noticing inconsistencies in her reports. When I asked her about it, she'd laugh and say, "You worry too much. You should learn to enjoy success." So I tried. I tried to enjoy it. But that feeling, that itch at the back of my mind wouldn't leave. Then, one day, it happened. A client called me, furious, demanding to know why we'd sent 2 different invoices for the same service, both with my signature. I froze, because I had only signed one. When I checked the files, I found another version, slightly altered, with my name forged at the bottom. The numbers were different. Someone had siphoned money. I confronted Zane that evening. He didn't even flinch. He poured himself a drink and said, "You really think I'd do something like that? You think I'd risk my father's name for a few invoices?" And then he smiled, that same charming smile that used to make everyone trust him. I wanted to believe him, but something in his eyes told me I shouldn't. The next few days were a blur of confusion. I checked more records, quietly, and what I found made me sick. Duplicate payments, altered signatures, ghost accounts, and every trail, every single one, led to me. It was like waking up in someone else's nightmare. I remember confronting Hamza. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He mumbled something about pressure and loyalty. That's when I realized he knew. He'd known all along. He was part of it. Samia played her role perfectly, pretending to console me, telling me not to overreact, that maybe I'd signed something by mistake. Every word out of her mouth was poison wrapped in silk. And then they made their move. One morning, I woke to banging on my apartment door. Police. They had a warrant. Fraud, embezzlement, forgery. They found documents all under my name, accounts I'd never seen, invoices I'd never signed. I remember sitting in the interrogation room, my hands shaking, trying to explain. But the evidence was overwhelming. They didn't just frame me, they built an entire world around my guilt. Zane and Samia stood in court, acting heartbroken, saying they never thought I could do this. Hamza stayed silent. The investors turned their backs. And the company, my company, burned. I was sentenced to prison for corporate fraud. 2 years. 2 years of rotting behind bars for a crime I didn't commit. My parents, they didn't survive the shame. My father had a heart attack during the trial. My mother followed a few months later. Their last letter said, "We still believe in you." That sentence has lived inside my chest ever since. Those 2 years changed everything. I went in as Araz Malik, a loyal fool. I came out as something else, something quiet, something cold, something patient. Because when you've lost everything, revenge becomes the only thing that feels like purpose. They taught me that betrayal looks like a thunderclap, sudden, impossible to predict. That's the version that makes better stories. The truth is uglier. Betrayal rarely arrives like a storm. It seeps, it corrodes. It is a hairline crack you ignore until the whole damn house collapses. The first cracks weren't dramatic. They were small inconveniences I shrugged off because I was tired, because I trusted, because I wanted to believe the easiest explanation. An invoice here that took longer to clear. A check that bounced and then, mysteriously, cleared the next week. A client who asked if we'd moved accounts and why no one had told them. I told myself it was bureaucracy, bad accounting, the kind of headaches every startup swallows while it grows. I told myself that because I didn't want to see what was already happening in the dark. It was Zane who taught me how to make people look away. He had that effortless charm, the kind that made you forgive him before you even knew what he'd done. When I raised a question, he laughed and poured tea like nothing was wrong. "Araz," he'd say, tapping the table with long fingers, "we're moving too fast. Small errors happen. Don't ruin the mood." He said it like a consolation and like a command. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to keep the company afloat and the dream intact. So I accepted his reassurance and buried my worry. Then came the call that made everything real. A client, one we'd pitched for months, rang me at midnight, voice raw with panic. "Why did you send 2 invoices?" he demanded. "Why does one say half of what we agreed and the other double? And where is the second payment going?" I stared at the screen until the letters swam. I'd signed one invoice. I remembered signing it in the small office, a pen left by the receptionist. I remembered the number, the neatness of the signature. I remembered my hand trembling because we were close to closing the quarter. But on the server, there were 2 documents. Similar, not identical. The forged one had extra zeros. It bore my signature, my name, but slightly off, like some. I was tried. The trial was a ritual where the facts danced to the tune someone else wrote. Evidence I had unearthed in the midnight hours was used against me as proof of my guilt, proving apparently that I had access and therefore motive and therefore opportunity. My parents sat in the courtroom like statues. My father's hands shook when he held my mother's. Their faces were a map of pain. They left the court in fragments I could not mend. 2 years is a long time to watch life move without you. It is an eternity of small humiliations and a curriculum in the anatomy of human cruelty. Prison taught me silence, not the noble quiet of meditation, but the kind of silence that is a strategy. You listen and you learn. You watch how people lie to themselves to survive. You read law books until the letters make sense and give you tools that weren't taught in business school. You learn the precise points where a system can be turned, the seams in institutions that only a patient man can find. My parents did not come out of that trial whole. My father had a heart attack. My mother faded into a long, quiet sickness that ate her from the inside. Her last letter, short, the kind of note that's heavy with everything she couldn't say, was 3 words: "We still believe." They believed when the rest of the world had already closed its shutters. When I walked out with a bag of old clothes and a criminal record stitched into my name, I realized 2 things with absolute clarity. 1. The world does not dismantle you for being weak. It dismantles you for being predictable. 2. Forgiveness in the face of monstrous betrayal is a luxury the betrayed are allowed only in stories. In life, forgiveness was a curtain you could step behind while they continued to take everything you had. Or you could stand and learn the architecture of their deceit until you could dismantle it piece by piece. I chose the latter. I chose patience as a weapon. I chose to study the map of their crimes, not to shout my pain into the void, but to prepare. Because rage without a plan is just noise. And justice, whatever that word means now, required precision. It required me to be silent until the moment when silence would be the last thing they expected. Rebuilding is not a movie montage. There was no swelling orchestra, no triumphant sunrise. It was a slow, grinding erosion of pride, of dignity, of everything that used to announce who I was. For months after I walked out of that courtroom with plastic cuffs still itching my wrists in memory, I existed in a narrow band of light between 2 terrible truths. The world had decided I was guilty, and the people who made it so were untouchable. Employers saw my record and saw a risk they didn't want. Friends became strangers. The city itself felt like a place I'd been exiled from. I slept in cheap hostels stacked like shoeboxes and learned the arithmetic of hunger. 1 meal a day, sometimes none. I took odd jobs that paid in cash and shame. Moving furniture at midnight, stacking shelves, answering calls for businesses that didn't ask for references. Every task was an exercise in invisibility, and I became very good at being invisible. You'll learn what it means to be unseen when the system has preferred another story about you. The first 6 months were a litany of anger and small humiliations. I'd stand in the shower and imagine the moment I'd find them and tear them open with questions.
I replayed the trial until it bled into my sleep. I held my parents' last letter until the paper softened, and sometimes at night I would read it until the ink smudged and I could no longer tell truth from hope. Revenge floated like a shape in the distance, unformed, useless without a skeleton. The turning point was stupid and mundane. I was standing on a bridge one winter night, staring at the city's lights and counting how many of them were actually windows and how many were just reflections on water. The breeze cut through the thin jacket I'd bought with the last of a one-off gig's cash. Two men sat on the other end, laughing too loudly, swapping lines like old scripts. One of them mentioned a name I knew, a small local company that had been in the headlines the year before for a cyber incident. They talked about how easy it was to create a shell account and have money flow through it like a river. How a few clicks, a forged signature, a diverted API endpoint, and suddenly the bookkeeping looks like an honest error. They weren't boasting about crime the way children boast. They were matter-of-fact, like surgeons discussing sutures. Something tightened in my chest. I listened until their cigarette smoke blurred and the words rearranged themselves into a pattern I recognized. They'd described in nonchalant terms the anatomy of a scam, the precise surgical way to remove value from a company without anyone noticing until it's too late. They spoke of loopholes in bank reconciliation protocols, of standard operating procedures that nobody read, of auditors who accepted PDFs without calling numbers. They weren't teaching me to steal. They were revealing the language of the machine that had eaten me alive. In that moment, clarity landed cruel and heavy. If I could learn how the machine worked, I could learn where it failed. If I could become fluent in the language of their deceit, I could translate their crimes into evidence. So I learned, slowly, like someone learning to breathe again. I consumed online courses, cybersecurity, digital forensics, penetration testing, those sterile academic words that now meant tools. I read law texts in the prison library until the sentences stopped being foreign and began to map the loopholes courts relied on. I devoured books on persuasion and human behavior, on how manipulators created narratives and how institutions built the scaffolding that made those narratives believable. I learned how signatures could be forged and how a duplicate email could be manufactured from a throwaway server and routed through 5 different countries to make jurisdiction a joke. I taught myself to speak the dialect of the system that had pronounced me guilty. I worked freelance under anonymous handles at first. Small gigs, fixing websites, auditing security, consulting on business structures. People paid in crypto or cash transfers to accounts no one traced back to me. My hands, once used to signing agreements with hope, now typed lines of code and legal briefs with a precision that felt almost reverent. The work paid little at the start, but it paid for food and for a laptop I could call my own. Each project taught me a new pattern, a new blind spot to exploit, not for theft, but for knowledge. I became a ghost in the system, a presence you felt but couldn't name. The first 6 months were a litany of anger and small humiliations. I'd stand in the shower and imagine the moment I'd find them and tear them open with questions. I replayed the trial until it bled into my sleep. I held my parents' last letter until the paper softened, and sometimes at night I would read it until the ink smudged and I could no longer tell truth from hope. Revenge floated like a shape in the distance, unformed, useless without a skeleton. The turning point was stupid and mundane. I was standing on a bridge one winter night, staring at the city's lights and counting how many of them were actually windows and how many were just reflections on water. The breeze cut through the thin jacket I'd bought with the last of a one-off gig's cash. Two men sat on the other end, laughing too loudly, swapping lines like old scripts. One of them mentioned a name I knew, a small local company that had been in the headlines the year before for a cyber incident. They talked about how easy it was to create a shell account and have money flow through it like a river. How a few clicks, a forged signature, a diverted API endpoint, and suddenly the bookkeeping looks like an honest error. They weren't boasting about crime the way children boast. They were matter-of-fact, like surgeons discussing sutures. Something tightened in my chest. I listened until their cigarette smoke blurred, and the words rearranged themselves into a pattern I recognized. They described, in nonchalant terms, the anatomy of a scam, the precise surgical way to remove value from a company without anyone noticing until it's too late. They spoke of loopholes in bank reconciliation protocols, of standard operating procedures that nobody read, of auditors who accepted PDFs without calling numbers. They weren't teaching me to steal. They were revealing the language of the machine that had eaten me alive. In that moment, clarity landed cruel and heavy. If I could learn how the machine worked, I could learn where it failed. If I could become fluent in the language of their deceit, I could translate their crimes into evidence. So I learned, slowly, like someone learning to breathe again. I consumed online courses, cybersecurity, digital forensics, penetration testing, those sterile academic words that now meant tools. I read law texts in the prison library until the sentences stopped being foreign and began to map the loopholes courts rely on. I devoured books on persuasion and human behavior, on how manipulators created narratives and how institutions built the scaffolding that made those narratives believable. I learned how signatures could be forged, and how a duplicate email could be manufactured from a throwaway server and routed through 5 different countries to make jurisdiction a joke. I taught myself to speak the dialect of the system that had pronounced me guilty. I worked freelance under anonymous handles at first, small gigs fixing websites, auditing security, consulting on business structures. People paid in crypto or cash transfers to accounts no one.
Buying back my childhood home felt like a theater of cruelty and kindness stitched together. The house was smaller than memory, the paint thinner, the garden a shadow of the one my mother kept. Inside, though, nothing had been touched. There were boxes with the same brown tape I remembered, a faded calendar pinned to the wall, my father's old watch on the dresser, stopped at the moment his heart betrayed him. Their photos sat on the shelf, faces captured in unguarded smiles. My mother with flour on her hands, my father in his office jacket, my parents at my graduation, beaming like they owned the world. I sat on the cold floor that night, a man who had walked through fire and found his hands empty, and I held their picture until the paper softened. I told them aloud what the letter had promised, that they had been right to believe in me. Saying it into a house that smelled like old tea was an act of reparation, a ritual to stitch the torn fabric of memory. I wrote a letter and left it at their graves. My hand shook as I folded the paper, not because I feared standing in front of their resting places, but because I was afraid of what words would surface when I had to make them real. The note was brief. It said, "Your son came back stronger, but he had to die first." It was melodramatic when I read it later, and maybe crueler than they would have wanted, but truth rarely comes clothed in delicate linen. It was the truth, a confession, a promise, a warning. When I placed that paper in their hands, I felt a release so small it was almost imperceptible, like loosening a knot you've carried in your chest for years. People asked me afterward what it felt like to have the world's judgment lifted. They wanted the cinematic flourish, the hero standing atop ruins, cape fluttering in a wind made for narratives. What I felt was quieter and more complicated. I felt the unease of a man who had learned to use cruelty as calibration. I felt guilty for how easily I had become what I had once despised. I had planned and manipulated, fed lies to liars, and watched them unravel the same way they'd unraveled me. There is a cost to that calculus, an erosion of softness that had once been my saving grace. Sometimes, at night, I wake with the taste of steel in my mouth, as though my patience had corroded me from the inside. Revenge had closed the circle, yes. It had corrected some measure of imbalance. Zion went to court. Samia disappeared from glossy magazine covers and reappeared in rumor. Hamza's confession was a public spectacle that left him hollowed and small. For a while there were satisfactions, documents that proved what I said they proved, depositions that aligned with the picture I'd painted, and the tactile thunder of people finally being held accountable. But algebraic justice, where sums balance and ledgers reconcile, does not mend the parts of you that were broken long before money and reputation came into question. Healing, I discovered, is rarely about demolition. It is about reclaiming the narrative enough to find ordinary joys again. It's about learning to cook a decent meal, about laughing at a joke that isn't built on resentment, about going to bed without replaying the strategies of a long con. Slowly, I allowed myself small anomalies of peace. A walk by the river where the city hummed its indifferent song. A call with a student who received one of the scholarships and thanked me with naive gratitude that made my chest ache pleasantly. A quiet cup of coffee in the kitchen my mother once used that tasted like the kind of memory that doesn't sting. I rebuilt, but not in the way I once had imagined. My priorities shifted like tectonic plates. People became more important than portfolios. Quiet became preferable to the blinding white of press rooms. Truth became less of a weapon and more of an ethic. I maintained a hard edge. Old habits die slowly. But I tried to use what remained of my fury toward things that mattered, like that scholarship foundation, like mentoring young entrepreneurs who needed guardrails, not predatory partners. I offered counsel now to those who asked, and I taught caution without cynicism when I could. There are nights when the old anger resurfaces, sharp and hot and righteous. I remind myself of the cost. 2 years of my life lost to a cell. My parents' deaths that may have been hastened by despair. Friends turned into enemies and back into cautionary tales. I remember Hamza's face in court, the way guilt had hollowed him, and I am thankful the justice served was proportionate enough to make an impact, but not so vindictive it would have completed our mutual ruin. I also remind myself that I had to become someone unrecognizable to set the scales right, and that recognition comes at the price of a softer self. The truth I keep coming back to is this. Revenge didn't fix the broken parts of my life. It closed an old ledger and opened another one where I could write my own terms. The healing came not from the collapse of those who hurt me, but from the act of reclaiming the story that had been stolen. When I look at my reflection now, older, quieter, edged with a patience I didn't have before, I recognize a man who has learned the hard arithmetic of consequence. I am not proud of every choice I made, but I own them. Ownership, I think, is the first step to living again. I stand sometimes outside the Zenith building and watch others pass through its doors. It's under new management now, quieter, yes, arrogant. People who work there pace and plan and fight for promotions and partnerships. Their dramas are not mine. I turn away and walk into the night, not because I'm fleeing, but because there are other streets to walk and other small mercies to attend to. Not a victim, not a saint. Just a man who was broken, who learned to navigate the shattered map, and who built a life from the ashes left behind. They ruined my life once, but I built a new one with their ashes.
Leave. He tried one last time. You're really doing this to me? I said, No, Ethan. You did this to yourself. He stepped outside. I closed the door. For a long moment, I stood in the silence I'd been denied for years. Clean, honest, final. This was the climax, not a wild explosion of anger, but a slow, deliberate unmasking. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. Part 5. Word count approximately 1,240 words. Replies 6 for Part 6, Aftermath and Reflection, approximately 1,000 plus words. The aftermath begins not with triumph, but with silence. Not the heavy, suffocating silence that once lived in the narrator's childhood home. Not the tense silence that used to fill the room whenever Ethan lied with a smile. Not even the painful silence that settled the night he saw Lena's messages and felt his world fracture. This silence is different. It is clean, light, almost peaceful. Like the air after a long storm, not quiet because nothing is happening, but quiet because everything already has. For the first time in years, the narrator feels like the noise inside his head has stopped. No more overthinking, no more analyzing every conversation, no more replaying moments, wondering if he should have seen the signs sooner. His revenge is complete. Ethan's lies are exposed. Lena's mask is shattered. The truth is no longer something he must fight for. It stands clear, undeniable, and witnessed by everyone who once saw Ethan as untouchable. But as the narrator walks away from the final confrontation, Ethan yelling, desperate, clawing for some last scrap of control, something strange happens inside him. He doesn't feel victorious. He feels empty. He acknowledges this quietly, honestly. Revenge doesn't give you your old life back. It simply burns the bridge to the one that betrayed you.